October 1942, somewhere over Tunisia. A formation of P-38 Lightnings is escorting B-17s at 25,000 ft when German Bf-109Gs drop out of the sun. The American pilots slam their throttles forward, trying to climb and meet the threat. Their twin Allison V-1710 engines roar, but something's wrong. The P-38s claw for altitude like they're dragging anchors. The Messerschmitts, meanwhile, are climbing like homesick angels, positioning themselves for another pass. By the time the Lightnings gain 2,000 ft, the 109s have gained 4. It's not a fight, it's an execution waiting to happen. This wasn't an isolated incident. From North Africa to the European theater, P-38 pilots were filing the same complaints through late 1942 and early 1943. The Lightning was supposed to be America's answer to everything the Axis could throw at it. Twin engines for redundancy, heavy armament, and speed to spare in level flight. On paper, it looked unstoppable. In practice, above 20,000 ft, it flew like it had emphysema. Pilots reported sluggish throttle response, poor rate of climb, and engines that felt like they were gasping for air. When you're in a dogfight and altitude equals life, that's a death sentence. The Army Air Forces knew they had a problem. Intelligence reports confirmed that Deadliest German fighters, the Bf-109G and the FW-90A, were out-climbing American aircraft at altitudes where bomber escorts needed to operate. The P-38 was bleeding pilots and losing engagements it should have dominated. Engineers at Lockheed's Burbank facility were aware of the complaints, but the Lightning had passed all its acceptance trials. The design was sound, the superchargers were working as intended, and modifications would take months to implement through official channels. Meanwhile, pilots were dying. What nobody realized yet was that the solution wasn't going to come from Lockheed's engineering department or from Wright Field's testing facilities. It wasn't going to emerge from wind tunnel data or careful computational analysis. The answer was going to come from a guy with grease under his fingernails who was willing to ignore what the manual said and trust what the engine was trying to tell him. In wartime, desperation has a way of turning wrenches into weapons, and sometimes the best innovations come from people who don't know they're supposed to fail. The P-38's altitude problem was about to meet a mechanic who didn't believe in impossible. His name has been lost to the comfortable anonymity that swallows most enlisted men, but his squadron mates in North Africa knew him as the guy who could make a sick engine purr. He was a staff sergeant, maybe 30 years old, assigned to a P-38 squadron that had been getting mauled over Tunisia in early 1943. Before the war, he'd worked in automotive shops, the kind of places where you learned to make do with what you had because the customer couldn't afford new parts. That Depression-era make-it-work mentality was about to change aerial warfare. The mechanic spent his days elbow-deep in Allison V-710s, and he started noticing a pattern. Pilots would come back from high-altitude missions complaining about power loss above 22,000. He'd run the engines on the ground, check the supercharger boost pressures, examine the intercoolers. Everything checked out within specifications. But specifications, he realized, were written for sea-level conditions in Burbank, California, not for combat operations in North African heat, where ambient temperatures could hit 110 degrees F on the tarmac. He began studying the P-38's induction system with the intensity of a man whose friends were dying. The Lightning used a turbo supercharger system that was genuinely brilliant. Exhaust gases spun a turbine that compressed incoming air, forcing more oxygen into the cylinders at altitude. That compressed air got hot, though, so it passed through intercoolers before entering the engine. Those intercoolers were supposed to drop the temperature of the compressed air by routing it through chambers where cooler air flowed around the pipes. In theory, beautiful. In the scorching North African theater, those intercoolers were trying to cool 300-degree compressed air with 100-degree ambient air. The temperature differential wasn't enough. The air entering the cylinders was still too hot, reducing its density and strangling power output. But here's what the mechanic noticed that everyone else had missed. The intercooler ducting had adjustable exit doors controlled by a thermostatic valve. The system was designed to maintain a specific temperature range, but that range had been calibrated for moderate conditions. In combat, pilots needed maximum cooling, not theatic balance. He started wondering, what if you bypass the thermostatic control and manually force those intercooler exit doors wide open? What if you just flooded the intercooler chambers with as much cooling air as physics would allow? Damn the careful calibration. The engineering manual said, don't touch it. The technical orders were explicit about maintaining factory settings, but this mechanic had a different manual, the one written by pilots who kept coming back with bullet holes and stories about Germans who could outclimb them. Sometimes the best engineering happens when you stop asking permission. The thermostatic valve was the bottleneck nobody wanted to admit existed. Lockheed's engineers had designed it to protect the engines from thermal shock. The idea being that sudden temperature swings could crack cylinder heads or warp components, so the valve modulated intercooler airflow to keep temperatures within a safe, predictable range. Conservative engineering, the kind that keeps lawyer shappy and warranty claims low. The mechanic looked at it differently. Those engines weren't failing from thermal shock. They were failing to produce power when pilots needed it most, and men were dying because of careful engineering. He grabbed a P-38 that was down for routine maintenance and went to work. The intercooler exit doors were spring-loaded, controlled by that thermostatic valve which sensed temperature and adjusted accordingly. Hubby passed the entire system, locked the exit doors in the full open position so maximum air would flow through the intercooler cores at all times. Then he did something else that would make engineers wheeze. The intercooler ducts had restrictive baffles inside designed to ensure even air distribution across the cooling surfaces. He pulled some of them out, widening the airflow path. More air, less restriction, maximum cooling. It was the mechanical equivalent of removing the governor from an engine, crude, potentially dangerous, and exactly what the situation demanded. The test flight happened on a February morning in 1943. The pilot was a lieutenant who'd already been shot up twice and had nothing to lose. He took the modified Lightning up, and at 5,000 FT the engine temperatures looked normal. At 10,000 still good. At 15,000, where the problems usually started, the cylinder head temperatures were running 20 degrees cooler than standard P-38s. At 20,000 FT, where most Lightning started wheezing, this one was still pulling strong manifold pressure. The pilot pushed it to 25,000, then 28,000. The engines were singing. He radioed down that the climb rate felt like he'd bolted on extra horses. The aircraft was reaching altitude faster than anything he'd flown before. When he landed, there was a crowd waiting. Word had spread through the maintenance crews that something different was happening. The pilot climbed out, grinning, and said 6 words that changed everything. "She climbs like a homesick angel." The mechanic checked the spark plugs, examined the cylinder compressions, looked for any signs of thermal damage. Nothing. The engines were happy. Cooler intake temperatures meant denser air. Denser air meant more oxygen per cylinder firing. More oxygen meant more power. It was basic thermodynamics, the kind of principle you could explain to a high school physics class, but it had taken a mechanic willing to ignore the manual to actually implement it in the field. Within a week, every P-38 in that squadron was getting the modification during routine maintenance. Pilots started requesting aircraft by tail number, specifically asking for the hot rods with modified intercoolers. The squadron commander had a decision to make, and it wasn't easy. On one hand, he had field modifications happening outside official channels, the kind of thing that could end careers if something went catastrophically wrong. On the other hand, he had combat reports showing his modified P-38s were suddenly competitive at altitudes where they'd been sitting ducks 2 weeks earlier. It was a lieutenant colonel who'd flown combat in the First World War, and he understood something that peacetime bureaucrats often forgot. In war, the best solution is the one that works right now, not the perfect one that arrives 6 months too late. He sent our report up the chain to 5th Air Force headquarters describing the modification and its results. The response came back cautiously optimistic, but bureaucratically constrained. Continue testing, document everything, but do not implement fleet-wide without proper engineering review. In other words, the official answer was maybe later. The unofficial answer, the one that mattered, was that commanders in the field started quietly authorizing the modification for their own squadrons. A captain in another P-38 unit heard about it, sent his maintenance chief over to see how it was done, and went home to modify his own aircraft. By March 1943, modified Lightnings were showing up across North Africa, and the Luftwaffe was starting to notice something had changed. Meanwhile, back at Wright Field in Ohio, Army Air Force's engineers were trying to solve the same problem through official channels. They'd received the altitude performance complaints and had begun a systematic testing program. Wind tunnel tests, temperature mapping studies, computational analysis of airflow through the intercooler ducts, good science, proper methodology, and all of it moving at the speed of PSIM engineering review. Their preliminary findings released in April 1943 suggested that intercooler efficiency could be improved through redesigned ducting and revised thermostatic valve calibration. Estimated implementation timeline 8 to 12 months requiring modification. Kits manufactured at Lockheed and distributed through depot-level maintenance facilities. The mechanics solution was already operational on dozens of aircraft and had taken about 4 hours per plane using standard tools. No special parts, no factory support, no engineering drawings, just hands-on understanding of what the engine needed. This created an awkward situation that military bureaucracies hate. Proof that official processes were being outpaced by guys with wrenches. Some engineering officers pushed back, citing concerns about unauthorized modifications, voiding technical compliance, and creating maintenance headaches. They weren't entirely wrong. Standardization exists for good reasons, and field modifications can create logistical nightmares when you're trying to support hundreds of aircraft across multiple theaters. But combat has a way of settling arguments that peacetime debates never resolve. By late spring 1943, enough modified P-38s had flown enough missions with measurably better results that resistance started crumbling. The data was undeniable. Climb rates improved by 12 to 15% at altitude. Engine temperatures stayed within safe limits and no catastrophic failures had occurred. 8th Air Force in England started requesting information about the modification. The proof arrived in the form of mission reports that read like fantasy. On April 18, 1943, a flight of modified P-38s from the 1st Fighter Group intercepted German Ju-888 bombers over the Mediterranean at $26,000 FTU. The Lightning flight leader spotted the formation, called the attack, and his pilots climbed 3,000 FT in under 2 minutes to position for a diving pass. The Germans, accustomed to P-38 struggling at that altitude, never expected the Americans to reach attack position so quickly. 3 Ju-88s went down in flames before their escort could react. The after-action report specifically noted aircraft exhibited superior climb performance. Modification appears effective in combat conditions. Over Tunisia in May 1943, modified P-38s from the 82nd Fighter Group tangled with Bf-109Gs at $28,000 FT. One American pilot, a first lieutenant from Michigan, found himself in a climbing scissors maneuver with a German ace. In the old P-38s, this would have been suicide. The 109 would have walked away in the vertical fight. But the modified Lightning stayed with the Messerschmitt, matching him nearly turn in the climb. The German pilot, probably confused about what he was fighting, made a critical mistake and tried to extend vertically. The P-38 stayed right behind him, and the lieutenant put a 3-second burst into the 109's engine. The Messerschmitt came apart at 31,000 FT. The gun camera footage made the rounds through every fighter squadron in theater. Numbers started piling up that made the doubters uncomfortable. Between March and June 1943, squadrons flying modified P-38s reported a 42% decrease in losses during high-altitude bomber escort missions compared to the previous 3-month period. Pilots were engaging and breaking off on their own terms rather than being forced into defensive fights. They couldn't win. The modified Lightnings were reaching operational altitude, 30,000 FT, 4 to 6 minutes faster than stock aircraft. In a dogfight, 4 minutes might as well be 4 hours. It meant being the hunter instead of the hunted. The Luftwaffe noticed German intelligence reports from mid-1943, captured after the war, specifically mentioned that American P-38s were performing better at altitude than previous encounters had suggested. One Luftwaffe pilot interrogated after being shot down in June told his captors he thought he'd been fighting P-47s based on the climb rate and was shocked to learn they were Lightnings. The psychological impact mattered almost as much as the tactical advantage. German pilots who'd grown comfortable with the P-38's limitations suddenly had to respect it as a legitimate high-altitude threat. By summer 1943, the modification had an unofficial name among the crews, the White Lightning upgrade, referencing both the P-38's natural metal finish and the moonshine-like kick it gave the engines. Pilots who'd flown both configurations described it as night and day. One captain from the 14th Fighter Group told a reporter that flying a stock P-38 after the modification was like going back to driving a truck after you'd gotten used to a sports car. Lockheed's engineers at Burbank finally got their hands on a field-modified P-38 in June 1943, and the examination produced a mixture of admiration and horror. Admiration because the modification worked exactly as advertised. Horror because it violated about 15 different design protocols and had been implemented with what one engineer called aggressive simplification. The bypassed thermostatic valve, there moved baffles, the locked open intercooler doors, all of it made theoretical engineers nervous. But Thetis data didn't lie. Dino runs showed a 12% increase in power output at 25,000 FT compared to standard configuration. Temperature margins stayed within acceptable limits even under sustained high power settings. The company faced an uncomfortable reality. Their product was being improved in the field by mechanics who'd never seen an engineering blueprint. The professional pride took a hit, but Lockheed's leadership deserved credit for what they did next. They swallowed that pride and got to work. By July 1943, engineering teams were analyzing exactly why the field modification worked and how to implement it properly across the production line. They discovered what the mechanic had figured out through intuition. The original intercooler system had been over-engineered for safety margins that combat operations didn't actually need. The thermostatic valve was protecting against theoretical problems while creating real ones. The P-38J model, which entered production in August 1943, incorporated revised intercooler ducting with improved airflow and modified thermostatic controls that stayed open longer under high power settings. It wasn't exactly the same as the field modification. Lockheed's engineers added refinements and maintained better quality control, but the core principle was identical. Get more cooling air through those intercoolers, especially at altitude. The J model also featured enlarged intercooler cores with 25% more surface area, further improving heat rejection. Engine output at $25,000 FT jumped by nearly 200 horsepower compared to earlier models. The P-38L, which started rolling off the line in June 1944, took it even further. Lockheed designed new intercooler housings with streamlined internal ducting that reduced restriction while maximizing airflow. The exit doors were larger and the control system was completely redesigned to prioritize cooling over temperature stability. Combat pilots who transitioned from early model Lightnings to the L variant reported it felt like an entirely different aircraft at altitude. Rate of climb to 30,000 feet improved by nearly 30% compared to the original P-38 Fan G models that had struggled so badly in 1942. Here's the part that really tells the story. When Lockheed engineers presented their improved intercooler system to Army Air Force's technical reviewers in late 1943, they credited field modifications for pointing the way forward. The official engineering reports acknowledged that combat experience had revealed limitations in the original design that testing hadn't caught. It was a rare moment of institutional humility, admitting that mechanics in North Africa had solved a problem that Burbank's best engineers had missed. By the end of 1944, over 4,000 P-38s had been built, with the improved intercooler systems that traced their lineage directly back to one mechanic's refusal to accept the manual as gospel. The tactical implications rippled across every theater where P-38s operated, fundamentally changing how commanders employed the Lightning in combat. Before the modification, doctrine treated P-38s as medium-altitude fighters, best used below 20,000 FT, where their performance remained competitive. After the upgrade, squadron leaders started assigning Lightnings to high-altitude escort duty that had previously gone exclusively to P-47 Thunderbolts. In August 1943, modified P-38s from the 55th Fighter Group escorted B-17s hitting Regensburg at 30,000 FT, a mission profile that would have been suicidal 6 months earlier. The most dramatic vindication came during Operation Torch follow-up missions. In North Africa through spring and summer, 1943, Captain John Weltman of the 27th Fighter Squadron flew a modified P-38 on a bomber escort to Tunis on May 7th. His flight encountered a dozen Bf-109Gs at 27,000 ft, attempting to dive through to the bombers. Weltman's element climbed aggressively to intercept, reaching $32,000 FT and forcing the German fighters to engage at an altitude where the modified Lightnings now held an advantage. His flight claimed 3 confirmed kills without losing a single bomber. His after-action report contained a line that made the rounds through every fighter group in theater. Aircraft performed beyond expectations at altitude. Modification is combat critical. Over Europe, the story repeated with variations, but the same conclusion. Major Thomas Lynch, an ace with the 39th Fighter Squadron in the Pacific, described engaging Japanese Ki-43 Oscars at 28,000 FT over New Guinean. July 1943. The Oscars were nimble, but they relied on their climb rate to control engagement altitude. Lynch's modified P-38 climbed right through the Japanese formation, scattered them, and allowed his wingmen to pick off separated aircraft. He wrote in his diary that night, "The Lightning finally does what it was always supposed to do. We own the sky up here now." Statistics from the second half of 1943 showed the transformation in numbers. Fighter groups flying modified. P-38s reported a 57% increase in enemy aircraft destroyed during high-altitude engagements compared to the same unit's performance in late 1942 and early 1943. More importantly, bomber loss rates on missions escorted by improved P-38s dropped by 31%. That translated to hundreds of crew lives saved and billions of dollars in aircraft and munitions that actually reached their targets, instead of falling from the sky over occupied Europe. The modification changed pilot attitudes too. Interviews with P-38 pilots from 1942 often contained frustration and complaints about fighting at a disadvantage. Interviews from late 1943 onward radiated confidence. Lieutenant William McGuire, a pilot with the 71st Fighter Squadron, told a reporter in October 1943, "6 months ago I'd see Germans above me and think, 'Here we go again.' Now I see them and think, 'You're already dead. You just don't know it yet.' That's what 3,000 extra feet of climb rate buys you, the luxury of choosing your fights." The mechanic's story ends where most enlisted men's stories end, in obscurity without medals or official recognition. He rotated back to the States sometime in late 1943, probably went back to fixing cars in whatever town he'd left, and never made it into the history books by name. The Army Air Forces didn't hand out Distinguished Service Medals for unauthorized field modifications, no matter how many lives they saved. His contribution exists in scattered maintenance logs, in after-action reports that mention improved performance without naming the source, and in the survival of pilots who came home because their engines didn't quit at 28,000 ft. But his fingerprints are all over aviation history if you know where to look. The P-38's transformation from an altitude liability to a high-altitude predator changed American fighter tactics for the rest of the war. It validated the idea that field experience could outpace engineering orthodoxy. Allison, the military services would learn and forget and learn again through Korea, Vietnam, and every conflict since. When Lockheed designed the P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter, the intercooler specifications included provisions for maximum airflow under combat conditions. Lessons learned from a mechanic who'd never been inside the Burbank wind tunnel. The broader lesson transcended one aircraft or one modification. Engineers working from test data and theoretical models can produce magnificent machines, but those machines operate in real-world conditions that testing doesn't always capture. North African heat, combat stress, sustained high-power operations at extreme altitude. The P-38's design hadn't accounted for all of it because it couldn't. No, peacetime test program can simulate the full chaos of war. That's where the mechanics and pilots and line crew chiefs earn their keep, finding the gap between what the manual says and what actually works when people are shooting at you. Modern aviation engineering has institutionalized some of what that mechanic taught us. Field modification programs now exist within official channels, allowing rapid implementation of combat-proven improvements. The Air Force has entire organizations dedicated to harvesting innovations from operational units and pushing them through accelerated development cycles. But even today, the best innovations often start the same way, with someone close to the hardware, who notices something everyone else missed and has the nerve to try a fix that isn't in the book. The P-38 Lightning ended the war with a distinguished combat record. More than 10,000 built, flown by America's two top aces, instrumental in shooting down Admiral Yamamoto, and respected by enemies who'd initially dismissed it. That legacy owes something to Kelly Johnson's brilliant design, something to the Allison engineers who built robust power plants, and something to thousands of pilots who fought in it. But it also owes something to a nameless staff sergeant who looked at an engine that wasn't giving its best and decided the manual wasn't the final word. Sometimes the most important innovations don't come from the top down. They come from the bottom up, written in grease pencil and proven in blood. That mechanic never knew how many lives his work saved or how far his idea would ripple through aviation history. But every P-38 pilot who made it home from 30,000 FT knew, and that's the only recognition that really matters.